The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Gala webinar series. My name is Manuela Noske, and I'm the Communications Manager at Gala. Gala is a global nonprofit trade association that enables communication and business across languages and cultures. We are headquartered in Seattle, Washington, in the United States. And today we're going to have a presentation by Catherine Allen, who will talk about the Indigenous Interpreter, a training program for Indigenous interpreters available to all. We will kick this off in a moment, but I need to go over our housekeeping items first. Everyone's lines are muted to cut down on any noise. If you have any technical difficulties, let me know by using your chat box, and I will work with you to troubleshoot them. If you have a slow internet connection, your audio may be disrupted. If that happens, you can use the number listed on the GoToWebinar panel to call in using your phone. We are making a recording of this presentation, and you will be able to find it following the presentation on Gala's global website. All participants will receive a link by email. If you have any questions or comments, please type them into your chat box, and we will get to as many of your questions as we can with the time remaining after the presentation. And so now let's actually turn to the presentation. We have invited Catherine to talk about this topic in conjunction with International Mother Language Day, which is tomorrow, always on the 21st of February. This is a worldwide annual observance that exists to promote awareness of linguistic and cultural diversity and to promote multilingualism, which is something we who work in the industry are very interested in. We invited Catherine to speak because she has worked as a healthcare and a community interpreter for over 3 decades, and her work over all of this time has in more than one way supported cultural awareness and multilingualism. So Catherine really is a practitioner. Catherine was a lead developer, and she's also a licensed trainer for the Indigenous Interpreter program, which we will talk about today. And she's helped embed professional interpreting into medical missions in Mexico. Catherine is, in case you don't know this, she's also the co-author of the Community Interpreter International, an international textbook, and the Medical Interpreter, a foundation textbook for medical interpreting. So I hope this gives you some background and some understanding as to why we timed it, this webinar to be taking place today, and for why we have made it a free webinar, which is accessible to all, because we really would like to share the message around International Mother Language Day with a wider audience today. And so without any further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Catherine for her presentation.
Great, thank you, Manuela. Thank you to Gala for inviting me and for being able to talk on this topic, which I know is a little bit outside of the norm of what is, we've done on Gala webinars before. I have a full presentation because I want to give you as much information as I can, and then hoping to leave about 10 minutes at the end. We also have a couple places where we're going to try and show a video, and if it doesn't work, you'll have to let Manuela know, and we'll just move on past that. So I'll give that as a little bit of a preamble. I wanted to just introduce myself quickly. This is an aerial picture of where I live, and if you look at the white things on the right-hand side, those are the Sierra Nevada mountains, and I live in this little canyon up the hill over right there. And I kind of wanted to show this today because if you just keep going west towards the coast in California, you will hit the Salinas Valley, which is the big agricultural valley, and that's where this project took place. I live rurally. I have been a community interpreter for a long time, but I also have professionalized as much as I possibly can. So I do have a master's of interpreting and translation from the Middlebury Institute. I got that master's degree about 10 years ago, and I have spent a lot of time since then. And the master's degree is in interpreting and translation. And I've really turned my attention to training and educating and doing everything I can to bring, the highest quality technique and pedagogy out into the community interpreting settings, because community interpreters in the United States are the majority of interpreters, and it's the biggest market are medical and legal in community markets. And the training is really, it's not absent, but it's very scarce compared to what we need it to be. So I spent a lot of time doing short course training and working on those kinds of techniques and pedagogies. I'm also co-president and co-founder of Interpret America, which is an organization that advocates for the profession. And as Manuela said, I've sort of gotten involved in a lot of textbook writing in the last few years. So I'm kind of all over the map. I still practice as a practicing interpreting and translator in my little area, but I really focus a lot on on education and training and trying to give people access to that. So today we're going to be talking about a large textbook and workbook called the Indigenous Interpreter, which is actually available for everyone to download, and we'll get to that in a minute. And I want to go through the program roots, and because I think it's important to understand why we were able to bring this to fruition when other programs perhaps have not, in terms of having a publication at the end result of high quality publication at the end. I want to go through the training model and the things we learned and just kind of highlight some of the innovative content, because in the end, I'm hoping that anybody on this call who's interested in taking whatever piece of this is relevant for them will go download these resources, and we'll use them, and we'll train with them, and we'll experiment with them and improve them and adapt them. The goal is to give some kind of foundational work so that people can have a resource that they can then make relevant to to your own work. So let's start by looking at the program roots. And before I talk about Indigenous Interpreting Plus, which is the program that brought this resource to bear, I really want to give credit to all of the many other organizations that predate Indigenous Interpreting Plus and will live past Indigenous Interpreting Plus. And some of them in California, just even in California, you have these different nonprofits that have been working on the front lines in the fields and in the work areas, doing what they can to professionalize and support the Indigenous workers that come in, and they have created interpreting training programs ahead of Indigenous Interpreting Plus. But because they haven't had the kind of resources we ended up having in our program, they haven't been able to take those programs and make them available in a broader sense. So I really want to give credit where credit's due, because those are the people who've really done the work, the beginning work in our field. And these, to me, this is just a little bit of a small sampling of all of the many small nonprofits that I know exist across the country, not just in California, that are doing this really important work. And ultimately, it'd be great if we could, as a field, get more connected with these organizations. So the resource that we're going to talk about today is called the Indigenous Interpreter. It is ultimately a training program that has 21 modules and encompasses 63 hours of training. And we produced a published manual and workbook, and that is what is available to the public. And there are also training materials, the PowerPoint slides and lesson plans, and kind of a beginning trainer's guide, and that is not available to the public. That would be something you go through Indigenous Interpreting Plus or through me or Victor Sosa, the other licensed trainer, if you wanted to actually have us come and do the training. So there's a little bit still behind a firewall, I guess. But these are the books that are available to the public. One is called the Indigenous Interpreter, a training manual for Indigenous language interpreting, and the other is a workbook, of role plays and activities that accompany that manual. And we'll go into the content in a little bit more, but this is the program, and it is available. I think I have the website, but it's available at the Natividad Foundation website, which is the foundation that sponsored this. So we did publish this book. The manual's over 600 pages, and the workbook is 400 pages. It's a huge work, and we published it under the Creative Commons license. And so if you are to use any of the materials, which I hope you will, this is the disclaimer that you're supposed to legally put up so that you can say, hey, this is where this material came from, and I have to put this disclaimer up for this credit, give credit where credit's due as well whenever I train about it. The origins of this work come from Natividad Medical Center, and this is the Central Valley, that I was talking to you about. It's just over the coastal hills from Monterey, California. It's basically where all of our salad and lettuce and berries come from. So where Driscoll's and some of the biggest berry companies in the world are based. And that is the hospital. There's two hospitals. Natividad Medical Center is one of California's public hospitals, and they founded a program called Indigenous Interpreting Plus in 2014 as a result of trying to find a way to serve the huge influx of Indigenous speaking patients that were coming in. The hospital already had a majority Spanish speaking population coming in, but then they found that they had many, many people flooding in that didn't speak Spanish. So if you look at the, this is where we get a lot of our agriculture. You've got about 30,000, this is even about 5 years ago, it's probably higher now. There are about 30,000 Indigenous migrants in the Salinas Valley alone, which is just a small valley in, in California's Central Valley, or the coastal valley, to be clear. It's not over against the mountains where Fresno and the really big cities are. It's actually closer to the coast. And so you have a lot of Spanish, and then you have Mixteco and Triqui and Zapoteco and Chiltino. You've got a lot of immigrants coming in from southern Mexico and Guatemala. So just to give you a sense of why it is so hard to provide interpreting services and why it is so hard to train interpreters in these languages, if you look at Mexico, you've got 11 linguistic families, you have 68 indigenous language groups, really, but inside those languages, there are over 364 variants. So just Mixteco alone has 81 variants. So if any of you have been working with Mixteco and you hear these terms, it's, it's high or middle or low Mixteco. Those are all kind of misnomers and taking us down the wrong path, because there aren't, that it doesn't exist really. It's really, you have 81 variants and you have to figure out the variant the person speaks, or you can't communicate. And in Guatemala, you have 22 Mayan languages. You've got different 5 different variants out of that. And this is definitely the population that's been flooding over more in the last few years. So when Natividad did a language survey to figure out what languages were being spoken, they realized that Mixteco, Triqui, Zapoteco, and Chiltino were their high, most common indigenous languages, and look at how many possible variants are coming through the door, just to receive service and receive medical care. So Natividad ultimately, after probably a decade or so of different fits and starts and trying, eventually realized, okay, we need to have a actual program to address it. And the foundation, which is a hospital foundation that supports the foundation itself, created something called the Agricultural Leadership Council. They didn't do it just for Indigenous topics. They did it as a way to support the entire hospital for all kinds of things, like becoming, like improving their trauma care and things like that. But this was a key piece of why this program worked, is that there was a very proactive CEO at the foundation, and she started looking for money and raising funds and started, beating the drum, for this issue, and raised for our program over $300,000 just for this Indigenous interpreting program to bring this to fruition. So there was, basically the founding team that, went through this was the CEO of the foundation. Her name was Linda Ford. She's no longer there, but she was, without her, this would never have happened, because she was that amazing fundraiser. And we had Angelica Cidro, who's an Indigenous interpreter, and Victor Sosa, who was the director of interpreting at the actual hospital. And then myself and Marjorie Bancroft, who many of you will recognize her name, were the senior consultants. And then we worked with really closely to create the program itself. We had 11 Indigenous interpreter graduates who had paid 6-month internships, who became, our betters and our pilot, people who took the pilots and people who read the materials and helped us with it. So it was definitely a mix from kind of a high level, administrative level, to the people working, in the hospital, and actually the interpreters who were training up and entering the field. There are a lot of barriers to entering the profession for Indigenous interpreters. I mean, there's barriers, period, in any language group, but when you speak a language, lesser diffusion, and there are a lot of barriers. So I just kind of want to go through some of this, especially with a newer population. Creating trust with the population itself, so you can even start recruiting people who may become interpreters, is a huge issue. The sheer diversity and variety, and actually smallness in terms of numbers of speakers of the languages, is a big barrier. Like in this country at this point, we've professionalized medical interpreting to the point where people are like, oh, well, you have, at least this many hours of training, and you've got your proficiency testing, and you can show this level of sort of entryway into a mainstream workplace. And those things don't exist in these languages. there is no proficiency testing, and there's just a huge problem of lack of equivalence of even the most basic terminology, or just a huge percentage of the terminology they're trying to navigate. There's no easy equivalent. And many of these languages have no writing system. So when you think about the whole issue of sight translation, or even navigating that kind of interpreting, it gets pretty complicated. Many of the interpreters, not all by any means, because we do have, you know, Indigenous communities here who've been here long enough where people have begun to become more, you know, we get more access to formal education. But many of the interpreters you're trying to recruit don't have a lot of formal education. And English, they may not have English, and if they do, it may not be just their second language, it might be their third language. So we were training people who, you know, spoke their Indigenous language and maybe spoke English and didn't speak Spanish, or they spoke their Indigenous language and had learned Spanish in the United States working in the fields and then learned English. I mean, it was sort of a lot of combinations like that. So just really widely varying levels of proficiency in their language, working languages. There can be a just profound lack of familiarity with the healthcare, social service, and community service systems, even in the way that perhaps Mexico, mainstream Mexico, and, you know, mainstream United States have a lot of similarities as Western, you know, countries with Latin-based service. You know, this is a lot of familiarity. If you have come straight from an Indigenous area, you may never have received, you may not have had access to Western medicine. You may have had your own kind of medicine, and you may have had a mix. I mean, it's just, so there's no way to really predict it. There's a lot of economic risk, and there's a lot of risk to enter the profession because he doesn't earn very much, and it's hard to get full-time work. And there are just some there can be very profound differences in the worldview and perspectives about what healthcare is and illness. And of course, you have to help the interpreter bridge those worldviews to be able to be an effective interpreter. And then there are a lot of barriers to creating this kind of program. We had to convince the hospital CEO, and then the next hospital CEO, and then the next hospital CEO that it was valuable to be paying attention to the most vulnerable populations. And then there was sort of an ongoing convincing of the foundation board, and there were sometimes it was highly supportive, and depending on who was on the board, maybe it wasn't as supportive. So maintaining that buy-in and support actually was a big piece of, you know, sort of political or, you know, strategic work that you had to do. And then sometimes you get this leadership changes at the top of the hospital, and then they'd be like, well, why are we putting all these, you know, these hundreds of thousands of dollars into this particular population when we could, you know, create an entire addiction program, or we could buy trauma equipment, or, you know, I mean, there's always competing needs for money, and the foundation was tending to all of the hospital's needs, not just this population. And then you have to convince the Indigenous communities that it's worth it to come in and take the trainings and be engaged and find trust with the hospital. Identifying candidates was, you know, a challenge, and getting participants to come to all 3 pilots. We piloted these 21 modules in 3 chunks, and getting them to come every time. You know, you deal with, well, which time of the year will they come, and do you pay them, and how do you identify who they are? You know, Victor Sosa and Angelica would frequently just go into like health fairs and go around to the small cities and small towns in the area. And some of our best candidates were literally recruited because they overheard them speaking, you know, an Indigenous language and English, and said, hey, you know, want to come get trained. I mean, it was like that level of effort to get people in. It wasn't, you don't put a flyer up and have people show up. And of course, the fact that we had funding made this possible, because without it, it's just who's going to do that work and who's going to get paid for it. So in terms, like, this is all, we're not even at the resource yet, but this is what there were years that went into sort of the slow building of relationship that the hospital had with the community before this program ever became possible. You know, so some of those relationships were, you know, they came from, you know, the nurses and the maternal health having a woman come in who they couldn't speak to, and they would eventually identify, if we call this small little church in, you know, this small little town, then we can find someone who can speak a little bit of English and help us with it. I mean, it started at that level, and then slowly people started to get to know each other. It really was a one-on-one relationship that started to build. And then you have to really figure out what the community is experiencing in the hospital, and figure out what is keeping them from coming in and what their trust issues are. And all communities have natural leaders, and especially when you get into small language groups and sort of cultural groups, they definitely are leadership, and you have to get the buy-in. And Angelica Isidro, who became key to this program, was a community leader, and so she was the one who created that bridge where she was able to recruit people into the program because people trusted her. We also learned that you have to train when and where the community is available. So if we offered a training in the fall or the spring, it was pretty much a no-go, or the summer, not at all, because everyone was working and they would not take a week of their life away. Even if you paid them and gave them, funding, they wouldn't come. They couldn't, because they had to prioritize their work. So we found that there was this narrow window of time in January and February when we could train, and that was when people would come. And we did offer paid training. We paid, people a small stipend, and we paid for their food and their lodging to come. And the hospital also, to its tremendous credit, created a very robust internship program so that the top candidates, that came out of that training actually had a pathway into becoming an interpreter. They had a 6-month internship with the hospital, shadowing the interpreters, learning the field, learning the profession. And many of those have then gone on to actually have part-time or full-time jobs at the hospital. So in terms of the process, we moved through. We had the community outreach. There was the hospital had the community outreach, and the first thing that Victor Sosa did was collaborate with the company that created Bridging the Gap and translate it into Spanish. He thought, okay, I'm going to translate this into Spanish. And we're going to give 40 hours of medical interpreting training, and that's going to get people up and running. But he found out, for all the positiveness in that effort, that it actually just wasn't enough, that the content of the typical 40-hour training that we have for healthcare interpreting, which is a whole nother conversation, why that is sort of a joke that we have 40 hours and then think people can go out and interpret. But it just wasn't, there were too many gaps still in understanding that it didn't bring people along. So then we moved to doing a lot of needs assessment and interviews of the community, of the hospital, of like I spent days just talking to everybody in all the different departments and talking to the interpreters and talking to the patients and figuring out how we could get a better process. And ultimately, through Indigenous Interpreting Plus, we organized 3 separate trips to Mexico and took doctors and interpreters and leaders and sort of a mix of people to go figure out what the healthcare looked like on the ground in southern Mexico, what was happening in Mexico around indigenous languages and training and health outreach, just to not, let's not recreate the wheel. We worked with immigrant advocacy groups and the consulates. And the very first thing we did was create a 5-hour professional training, conduct training, which just gave people an orientation to how to behave and work inside a hospital setting, which is very different than the other kinds of service jobs that many of these candidates were coming from. And then they realized they needed to offer the paid, the internships as well as an adjunct to any training. And then when we started to create the training, we realized, we ran multiple pilots to figure out what would work and what wouldn't work, and ultimately, worked very closely with the interpreters who were receiving the training and getting their input, and that went into the manual and the workbook. Because, you saw my picture. I am a, white American blonde lady who does not speak an indigenous language, and I brought, I am the author, the person who wrote most of these books, but in terms of getting the first iterations down on page, but I was trying to channel other people's knowledge and other people's wisdom, because otherwise there's no legitimacy to this. So we just tried, but we had to have all those different kinds of members in the teams because we needed different expertises to make this move forward. So as I said before, the whole time we're doing this, it took about 5 years. There's just sort of a cycle of like going through each of the stages and justifying the hospital. So it took us about 5 years from start to actually publicizing. And I wanted to kind of let you see a video of this, and I'm going to play it for a few minutes, and then please write in the chat if you can't hear it, and we'll pause, we'll just move it on and go on. If not, we'll see if we can play it. It's just a few minutes long. We'll see.
Before we had Indigenous interpreters, it was very intimidating and very scary to take care of these patients.
So I'm going to pause for a minute. Manuela, you just break in and tell me if people are saying they can't hear. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead.
I don't have any information. Oh, they say they can hear. Okay, that is great. It's a little choppy because I think of the internet connection, but let's try it again. Let's start it. Perfect.
Okay, great. So play it slowly here and go through here.
Before we had Indigenous interpreters, it was very intimidating and very scary to take care of these patients. I wasn't able to communicate well when the patient first come in. It's very unrewarding because they don't really understand that we're there to help them. They didn't trust us. Now that situation doesn't even happen. It's been amazing for us. It's been very rewarding to take care of these patients as we've been able to prepare them and talk to them and understand where they're coming from culturally.
Kubibakas kwendando tratando sendo in ambulancia. Sindi kundo imakinan doña kundanin tu siya lo sendoña awa kandita ni malo eh.
Benakah eso renakah no man no eso hospital ni ikabe yaron ni ikabe.
Hi, my name is Dr. Chad Harris. I was part of the Oaxaca team that went down this summer to better understand our patients here in Monterey County, our Indigenous speaking patients. Before I traveled to Oaxaca, I understood that there were some significant differences in the understanding and appreciation of healthcare from the Indigenous speaking patients. But what the experience helped me with was to bridge the American interpretation of healthcare to the Indigenous interpretation of healthcare and how better to serve our patients. Speaking to a Zapoteco interpreter, we discussed tuberculosis, and interestingly, they described it as a devil strangling them, which helps us understand how to communicate to our Indigenous speaking patients on how to describe a medical concept to them. To them, tuberculosis feels like the devil is strangling their neck.
As soon as we began to provide interpretation, we started to receive calls from all over the country. And we realized that this was not just a local need, but was a regional and a national need.
Our ability to provide a higher level of quality of care is greatly enhanced. It's great for the patients and it's rewarding for the doctors.
One of the main parts of this project that I'm involved with is the creation of a 60-hour, 21-module training program that will include all of the basic skills that you need to be able to enter into the interpreting profession and say you're competent and qualified. These tools don't exist currently. Right now, if you speak an Indigenous language, there are not trainings targeting you particularly. There is no easy way to measure your language proficiency, and there is no easy way to determine if you really have skill in interpreting in both languages.
Good morning, Dr. Cruz. This is Angelica, and I am Victor. We will be your interpreters for today. Sure. Since Mr. Ramiro speaks Mixteco, we will require 2 interpreters for today, and we'll be doing a relay. So we will take turns interpreting from Mixteco to Spanish to English. My vision for Indigenous Interpreting Plus is to be able to provide a means of training, work experience for individuals that speak Indigenous languages.
Indigenous Interpreting Plus was the realization that in order to provide language access to these patients, you were actually going to have to provide jobs to the interpreters themselves. And that started us on a journey that is very unexpected and has taken us in many unexpected directions. But in the end, we have this wonderful service where now multiple languages are being offered with trained interpreters, and we're really excited about it. Okay. I hope that went.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Manuela.
There's a quick question here that maybe others are interested in as well, and that is this video by any chance available on YouTube or Vimeo or any public site?
So I encourage you to let Manuela email that to me when we're done. And I think it is on their website. So I will provide the link for that. But I believe it's on the Natividad Foundation website.
Great. And then I'll include it in my follow-up mail together with the link to the recording. That would be super.
Okay. And I am actually willing to share the whole slide deck. It's a big slide deck with all of this. I mean, you could rewatch the recording. but it is embedded in there as well. So,
Great. Thank you.
so we'll try and make it available. Okay. So let's go on and get to the actual training model. I'm assuming that many of you are interested in that. So as I sort of said at the beginning, we designed it in blocks of modules of 21 modules. Each module is about is one topic, and it's designed to teach about 3 hours on that topic. So the consecutive interpreting module is 3 hours of consecutive interpreting. And the idea to make it modular that way is that you can take, you don't have to train the whole thing all at once, so you can offer certain parts of it and target it. We just wanted it to be as flexible as possible. So we have these modules, we have an accompanying manual workbook, and we have the training materials. And these were the authors. I think I showed the team a little bit. You saw some of them in the video. Victor has just moved on from Natividad, but he's the director of interpreting services there for many years. And Angelica was the Mixteco, a woman who actually started by taking phone calls while picking, crops in the field, and she would put her phone and tie it in her scarf and have it, smashed up against her ear and her mouth, and she would interpret while she was picking, until finally they gave her enough job security, that they were able to hire her out of the fields. And then, of course, Marjorie Bancroft and Cross Cultural Communications actually is the publisher. They're the ones who published and developed did the graphic design and everything on the book. And I just have to put Linda Ford in here again. She was this having someone at the top of the organization who put their weight behind this kind of vision is really what made it possible. And I just think we all know that from language access, that the higher up you go with the support, the better it is. And that was just the same in this case as well. So in terms of the actual training, we've got, there's 21 modules, and this is the first 8. And so, you've got an introduction to Indigenous interpreting, and you have a lot of the same content, topics that you would cover in the 40 hours. But we added things into it that actually don't exist in other trainings. One, the whole first chapter around the introduction to Indigenous interpreting really talks about what the barriers are to Indigenous interpreting, what the challenges are, what you need to take into consideration to be able to recruit and sort of have a relationship with interpreters to get them into the field. And we also, right up at the front with this consecutive interpreting, we really embedded reflective practice and taught people how to do the activities in a way that we don't typically do in our 40 hours. I mean, I think we actually think we need this in our regular 40-hour trainings, but we taught people how to be in role plays, how to become comfortable actually giving each other feedback, because that was very difficult when you have a group of 20 people being trained, and you may have a community leader, and you may have an 18-year-old in the room, and then you're telling the 18-year-old, well, give feedback to this community leader about how their interpreting was. I mean, there's sort of a big ask to do that. So we worked hard to try and smooth some of those more difficult sort of gaps in how things are done. And then we have, a whole section on interpreter self-awareness, which we might title in a little higher register and call it unconscious bias, or, really looking at that. But we really spent a lot of the time helping people understand what they were bringing into their role as interpreters. So these are some of the things that I think, are important. And the other point too that's not circled here is the building Indigenous language glossaries. I feel like that we came up with a very good technique for helping people create glossaries to get at equivalence, not just terminology, but like, how do you actually create a valid equivalent of a term that doesn't exist? For example, if cancer doesn't exist in your Indigenous language, the very common term that I often hear in California is that, Indigenous interpreters would say, oh, it's a disease that kills, which is a terrible equivalent for cancer because it doesn't always kill. And so you have to come up with some kind of term like, a disease that causes uncontrolled growth in a part of the body or something like that. They really have to understand what the disease is. And so we train a process around that. And I think that's one of a significant contribution of this training, content. And then the next 8 modules, we have a mediation intervention module. Again, many things that, are in topics that get touched upon, not necessarily in all 40 languages, but, we do have trainings for. But one thing that we worked hard on was to try and, create some kind of content that would help people bridge the gap between, a more Indigenous healthcare approach to a biomedical culture. And of course, all these things are terribly fraught, and difficult, because you don't want to have anything be caricatured. We don't want it to be too simplistic, but you also want to give a nod to it and find a way to talk about it. And so all these things we tried to get down on paper in a way that would work. We have a whole module on cultural mediation and how to mediate these cultural dilemmas around, become this big gaps in understanding, like, why won't this person allow us to take their blood? Because there's this big health belief around, not losing blood. And this is, this program, it clearly is focused around, South America and, in southern Mexico and Guatemala. But we tried to create a model that you could take the health information or take these ideas and apply it to an Indigenous interpreter from, Asia or from Africa. You would just have to switch some of the content out. I think we wrote the first chapter on consecutive relay interpreting. That I could find anywhere. I could not, where it's written down in a pedagogical way. So I think that's a contribution that hopefully could be very helpful to people. There's a lot of instructions in that chapter, a lot of protocols and adaptation of protocols, and you got to see a little tiny demonstration of how we were training people just in the beginning, like your professional introduction, like how do you handle professional introduction when there's relay interpreting. We also put a lot of new content into helping Indigenous interpreters navigate if they're in a legal or community interpreting setting, how to, sort of identify whether they had an appropriate skill set, and if they didn't, how they could ask for additional support to be able to accept some of these assignments that require a lot more training than they're probably ever going to get, but we still need them. We need them in the courtroom. We have a whole thing on mental health interpreting, and which I think also was very powerful, because for many of the participants, it was the first time they'd ever talked about mental health and, just mental health issues, much less interpreting for them. And then we have an introduction to simultaneous interpreting. I do think it first chapter that, an attempt to talk about the simultaneous challenges between Indigenous languages to Simul, and like what are the additional kinds of training you need, and foundation you need to be able to do a decent simultaneous, like in a legal or medical setting where you've just got no equivalencies, how deep your knowledge has to be to get to the place where you can do a simultaneous interpreting. And we have a chapter on remote interpreting. It's a very fun chapter. We go through telephonic and video, and so you sort of see it. And there is the 21st module is review and evaluation, and that content is in a PowerPoint. It's not in the manual, because that's sort of if you're actually taking the training. So that's the contents. And, in terms of trying to break down the structure and the pedagogy for you, basically we created this module structure and we put it in plain language. And that actually was one of the hardest things for me, was to write about, interpreting can be very abstract to write about it, interpreting skills and learning it, and it can be quite sophisticated in its content, and you don't want to lose any of that sophistication, but you have to figure out a way to put it into very plain language, knowing that the people navigating this may have English as their third language, or may not have had access to formal education where they have a lot of training in abstract academic thinking. So if you read it, you'll see, I think even as long it gets better and better. The first chapters are more, a little higher register, and then, but we made a huge effort to put it into plain language. Reflective practice, or this self-evaluation, is embedded in it, so we do everything we can to teach people how to keep teaching themselves to improve their skill set. We created a lot of tools, and I'm going to show you a few examples of those, as we get near the end. Just a lot of tools for, like, here's 4 steps for how to do this. Here's a checklist for how to do this. We wanted to make it as concrete and actionable as possible. I do feel like there's a contribution in here around how to approach glossary creation and equivalence for Indigenous languages into, English and other Romance languages. And we did a lot of adapting of standard medical and healthcare interpreting protocols and intervention or mediation strategies. We did a lot of adapting of those to try and give people more clearer pathways for how to get those skills set. And probably for me, the most important thing through a lot of these elements is that we did everything we could to give as much agency as possible to the Indigenous interpreter, because unfortunately in our field, and I hear this all over, I've trained all over the West Coast around Indigenous interpreting in legal settings and in healthcare and community settings. And a lot of times what you hear from the Indigenous interpreters and what you heard from the invited speaker for the Interpreters Division in ATA this year was that the Spanish speaking, for this language pair, the Spanish speaking interpreters are not always the friend of the Indigenous interpreter, and that Indigenous interpreters don't have this sense of like, I have this, irreplaceable skill set that you need. And so I'm going to have agency around it and say what I can and can't do and advocate for myself in terms of how to be professional in this. And so there's a lot that we need to learn about how to be partners and allies for Indigenous interpreters to support them in that. And we really tried to embed that through the training as much as we could. In terms of the pedagogical method, what most programs do, is that they'll teach about the skill. We'll have a little mini lecture about the skill, a little presentation about the skill, and then we'll practice the skill. And this kind of goes in that order. And these modules are all have tweaked that methodology a bit. And really, the very first thing we do is practice some element of the skill or get thrown into some activity that gets people to relate to the skill on a very personal, concrete level. Then you can back off and describe the skill and kind of teach what the skill is, and then you go back and practice it again. And we found that was necessary for people to be able to relate to what we were trying to talk about. Like, we just need to give you a personal, boom, we're going to ask you to do it. You may not do it well, you may have no idea what you're trying to do, but you're going to get there in there, and then you have this very personal way of relating to what you're being taught. And in terms of a broader sort of step-by-step approach, this is the short course training approach, which I basically apply to all of my short course training, and which we did 100% apply here. And this is the approach that I believe was what makes these materials adaptable to many different cultures and settings, because basically you start by you run some kind of baseline, you frame the skill, you'll define it or describe it briefly, then you'll demonstrate it. Somehow it has to be demonstrated. It drives me nuts that we are constantly trying to teach interpreters something that we are not providing them a demonstration of, whether it's a video demonstration or yourself doing it. Then you break down whatever the components are of that skill, and then you give them some way to identify a personal goal or a practice goal and objective, so they can continue to work on that skill out beyond the training. And then you start by doing, you end by doing, so that this is the training approach for the entire course. And that's what we've embedded into every module. And the other thing that the training manuals do is that they're cumulative. So, you start with the base skills, and you move on into complexity. You notice that mental health interpreting was near the end, because that's where you have to first teach the basic skill before you can adapt protocols and adapt behavior and sort of nuance into mental health. And so we have kind of this visual here, which would show you what is the overall toolkit that a community interpreter has. And you've got your language proficiency as a base, and you have your basic modal skills as a base, your interpreting skills, message transfer skills. And then you have all these other tools that help you navigate that all community interpreters need, that we teach in, the community interpreter and other kinds of trainings. But we just we put it in a cumulative and progressive way throughout the training. And so you can see some of these things are like the tools, like we teach them how to say no to inappropriate requests so they can stay inside their role boundaries. We teach them a 4-step process for ethical decision making, so they can make decisions about whether they should be doing something or not doing something. And that is huge for them, because they are constantly being asked to be more cultural navigators and mediators often, and explainers than interpreters. And so they really have to learn how to navigate those issues. So that's kind of the structure. I just wanted to share a couple quotes that we have from some of the interpreters that we worked with. And we have many stories of how they felt empowered through these trainings. And so without training, I didn't have the courage to say what I needed, but with the training, it really helps. I learned how to stand up for myself, how to talk, where to stand. it gave me permission to do this. So basically it's giving them their permission to set their proper roles and boundaries in a way that they didn't feel like they could before. And then another comment, for me, the best way to learn is through role plays, because that is what happens in reality. The doctor and patient are talking and you don't have any script. This is the best way to teach a student. So, you know, they appreciated the practice they got, I think, as we all do when we get decent training. And here's some just examples, like, you know, we were in a hospital, so we can use the hospital to help train them and get them into realistic positions. So these are pictures actually of the interpreter, not, you know, of the interpreters themselves practicing. This is training from our remote chapter where we didn't have any access to internet, and so we taught, we created a little fake video thing, and so I was able to, because they are often put onto remote calls, and so we were just doing basic training around what not to do on a video screen, how to behave on a video screen, and these other two pictures are them mimicking and actually doing telephonic interpreting, where we would send two people outside with a phone and one person inside, and they actually had to interpret off the phone. You know, just trying to give some basic training around all of this. Lots and lots of group work. You know, just sort of, personally, I think pictures say a lot more than words sometimes. We have taken parts of this training to Mexico on 3 different occasions and you know, translated it, and there's huge interest and demand for it as well. So to wrap up this section, just the lessons that we learned. One is that you have to provide a broader frame for all the core concepts. Don't assume knowledge. You have to make sure everyone's on the page all the time, you know, same page all the time around. Just make sure, okay, this is what we mean by, you know, something, I don't know, just what is an intervention or anything along those lines. Make it as activity-based as possible. You need to make activities that are adaptable to low literacy. So lots of videos, you know, in the group work, we often had to identify the stronger readers and make sure that there was a good reader. You can't do it completely orally, you know, so they could read instructions or write things down on flip chart pages. You really need to give as much time as you can to give these interpreters a chance to sit in their language groups and talk to each other, because that is what they most are missing, and they all have different levels of literacy. And so, you know, they all have different, you know, different sort of understanding as well. And so just giving them the time to sit down and hash out, how should we find an equivalent? What should the equivalent be? You can really leverage the use of smartphones and social media because they all have this technology, and it's a huge tool for them moving forward. And really leveraging your group work for evaluation and feedback, and some of the many, many lessons we've learned. And also, you have to find a way, if you're going to have some kind of evaluation or test, you have to be able to administer it orally for some people. So, so in this sense, even though I'm kind of flooding you with lots of information, another huge takeaway for us is really you want to get less is more. One topic per 3 hours. Don't try and get a whole topic across the table. Just get the core skill and the core takeaways, and hopefully they'll walk away with a base skill they can work on. So I'm just going to go through, Manuel, I'm going to take a few minutes into the 10 minutes, and I just want to give you some of the visuals from inside the book, this in terms of what I feel like we did most with innovative content. I won't comment on it a lot. I just want to show you some of the visuals. This is an example of the graphic design in the, you know, like there's lots and lots of pictures like this where we just made it as visual as possible. Here's how to do a group role play practice, you know, and again, this quote here kind of iterates. When I took this training, I didn't like it at first because we had to give each other feedback, but then they learn how to give each other feedback. But the trainer taught us that it was normal to make mistakes, and that's how we could learn to do things better. Obviously, we're doing this in all of our trainings, but this was just really important to get this down on page and really normalize it, and something I think is important. We have checklists for assignment preparation, checklists for the interpreting assignment process, like what you should do with step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, additional checklists for first contact. We taught them a lot about evaluating their own abilities and asking for accommodations, like, no, yes, I can take that assignment if it can be in consecutive, not simultaneous. It's, you know, for a lot of the court assignments. Or could I have a could we do it in relay, even though, because it's a more complicated assignment, I'd like to do it with a relay interpreter, that kind of thing. We adapted some of the longer decision-making models we use in the field into just 4 steps for ethical decision-making, and ran them through a lot of exercises. So we have, this model. We created sort of a whole process for how to approach the patient history process, especially because there's so much site translation involved in that. And so how to navigate patient forms and questionnaires and things like that. Here's a look at some of the, just quickly, some of the, what's inside these books, which you can download, around how to handle equivalencies. And then the other thing we did was we took the National Council in Healthcare Interpreting National Code of Ethics and Standards, which is the only sort of formalized standards and Code of Ethics and Standards of Practice that we have for community interpreting, which has come out of medical. And we made a plain, we gave them the regular version, and we made plain language versions. And we did that for every single standard of practice and for ethical principles. So we gave them the NCIHC language, and we gave them the plain English right next to it, because some of it is actually quite high register, very abstract. And then we did a lot around this relay interpreting, which I think was, really, to me, we spent a lot of time adapting the protocols and figuring out how to give people step-by-step ways to really have relay work better. So I think those are some of the innovative things that are in the book. And I'm going to go, we did have one more video that just sort of shows them talking, which I will find you links for. But in the end, what was the outcome of this program? You've got impressional interpreter who have been hired as employees. This young man up here on the top picture is actually working his way to become, his goal is to become a doctor, and he's on his way in that pathway, and this has given him a big boost. There's been workforce development. People have much better access to healthcare and higher quality care. And here, just to leave you, here's a picture of the inaugural training class we had when we ran the first 63 hours all in a row a couple of years ago. It was an amazing group. And I'm going to thank you. And I'm realizing that I have not, Manuel, we're going to have to give you the link. It's like, I have to give you guys the link. I thought I had a slide that had the link for this. I'm so sorry. Somehow that slide is not in here, but it's the Natividad Foundation. I think it's natividad.org at this point, but I'm so sorry. We will email that out to everybody, because I thought I had it on this slide.
No worries.
So that wraps up. Yeah, that wraps up my presentation. Thank you so much. I think I'm going to leave it with this picture because I love that, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you, Kevin. This is really interesting. It's very inspiring work that you're doing, and it's also wonderful to see how applicable it is and how repeatable. So it's great work. We do have a couple of questions here. Let me start with this one, and that is: do you offer a train the trainer program?
Not formally, but so what's happened post this and post Linda leaving is that we have this program, and it's been made available free, and Victor and I are the licensed trainers, but the Natividad Foundation itself is not supporting it in the same way it was what Linda foresaw, and is why she pushed so hard to have it be published and made available to everyone. So the way I could put together a train the trainer, this is my deepest goal, is that we get, I would personally love to see Indigenous interpreters trained as trainers on this. So yes, there's not a formal program, but it is possible to do, and you would have to do it through me or through Victor Sosa, because we are the 2 people empowered to do that.
Great, thank you. And then do you have any glossaries that you can share?
I don't have glossaries in these different languages. I don't have glossaries. We do, all of these interpreters have created their own glossaries. See, these are the big need. This is one of the, if this program could have been permanent forever, one of the goals we had was to create something like that, like create a wiki where you could really start getting these glossaries up and available and collaborated upon. So I have interpreters I could point you to, or if there are languages you're looking for support in, I could try and make connections, but we did not develop glossaries like that.
Okay. Is there a plan?
But there are, but some of those associations so depending on what languages it is that you're interested in, some of those initial nonprofits that I pointed to at the very beginning, they do have glossaries. that they've created inside their organization. So they're there. It's just a matter of getting connected to them. So I'm happy to be a connection if I can.
Cool. And then we have a very general question here, and that is somebody's asking for more information in general about Indigenous interpreter trainings. Is there anything you could share beyond the Indigenous interpreter, what you talked about today? Or is there sites that people can go to? Or?
Well, those, so again, and I'd be happy to share them out. I mean, it depending on what, culture and language you're looking at. I'm more familiar with what's happening in California than in other places, but there's things happening in other places. Those smaller associations are offering training locally to people, and they even have conferences. And there's an association in Southern California that's putting on a yearly Indigenous Interpreter Conference. But they're really small efforts, right? I mean, they're hard to get on the radar screen. So again, I really encourage people to just email me, and I will try and connect you to whatever. I mean, I don't have the perfect connections, but I do. I'll do my best, right?
Cool, thank you.
So,
and are there any plans for a revised version, and how can people give feedback on what was just published?
I mean, so there's no plans because there's no longer the push to fund it, right? I mean, so that you can provide me with feedback or collaborate with me to do something that, I mean, we put it out there, and to me, it's a foundational thing that needs to now be taken and worked on and adapted and changed. But I don't think it's going to be revised in any time soon, because there's not a way to do that. Unfortunately,
yeah.
It's like, so yeah, these programs have their cycles, and so I'm forever grateful that we were able to push this out, but it's sure. Right now it's not
a
wonderful
program. Yeah. So, and then one last question here. I'm not sure if you can answer this, but one person saying they're very interested in the issue of evaluation and accreditation, so quality control. For your program, is there such a moment where you do an evaluation and call them done or fit or not fit, or?
There is there is a written test. There is a set of criteria for the training around, levels of participation, how much you take it, and then a test at the end to show comprehension. The next step, we did spend a lot of time in Mexico, and in Mexico, INALI, which is the National Association of Indigenous Languages, has developed a very robust way of determining proficiency and interpreting skill in Indigenous languages, and they have a really interesting model, and I have a good handle on that model, and that's the model it could have been a next step, which it's not going to be right now, but like to develop that, both proficiency testing and interpreting testing for actual testing of skills. So right now this program stops at kind of the level of, it's a certificate of training, and to get the certificate you have to pass the test, to show that you understood the content, but it does not test interpreting skill.
Yeah. Yeah, one last quick one. I guess here's a person who's interested in the specific interpreters that you have trained. Is there a registry where they can be contacted, or are they all fully employed now by the hospital? Or
no, I mean, they're not. So they have, I mean, the hospital is the same as in any other field. The hospital can hire a few of them in the highest levels of need. And then the others are trained and are available for, contract work. So the link, and I still can't believe I didn't have the slide up, but so the link is interpret NMF for natividad.medicalfoundation.com. So I don't know if you can put that in the chat box, but it's interpret NMF.com. That takes you to Indigenous Interpreting Plus, and that takes you to the hospital, so you can try and contact the interpreters who've been trained.
Okay.
Through them.
I am trying to put it in there, but no guarantee that I got it right. So I'm just going to send it to all. All right, Catherine, we have reached the top of the hour, which means that we have to close. People often have to head to another meeting. Thank you so much for doing this today. It's a really interesting, to my mind, really interesting project that you worked on. As I mentioned, very inspiring. And thank you to our audience for listening in and for all the questions that you contributed. If you can, please give us just a minute of your time and fill out the post-event survey, which is really, really short, but it helps us to, perspectives help us to continue to refine our webinar program. And with that, I wish you all a good day or good night, depending on where you are. And I look forward to seeing you at another Gala webinar soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.